When we think about the move towards more sustainable energy, we tend to think about the replacement of fossil fuels with renewable equivalents at source. But in reality, the renewable sources of energy we have aren't drop-in replacements for their fossil fuel predecessors. Transitioning from a present where we supplement fossil fuels with renewable energy to a future where we must be able to entirely depend on renewable energy will necessitate an overhaul of our entire energy ecosystem, from our sources of energy to their delivery for consumption. In meeting this challenge, Ireland stands to not only become a net exporter of energy to Europe, but an exporter of solutions to the world. However, in a world where we are vaguely told that a range of solutions will be required to meet our renewable objectives, there's little clarity on which solutions will make the final cut. So what are the challenges faced by investors, and how do they look at the future to decide where their capital is best allocated? To find out, I'm talking with two people who have impressive records of identifying and delivering what's been needed for our energy transition to date. They have both been the CEOs of semi-state companies and went on to found highly impactful renewable energy businesses. They are now focused on paving the path towards net zero. Eddie O'Connor of Supernode, the business behind the technology that will enable a European supergrid, and John Mullins of Amarenco, an Irish company playing a leading role in solar PV development internationally. I'm Paddy Finn, and this is the Electricity Exchange. Eddie, John, it's great to get to talk to you. Particularly about this topic around investing in energy. So at the moment, we really see that capital markets are all really looking for an ESG slant on a lot of investments, and money is moving really into the green sector. So why is green so bankable right now?
I think most corporates across the world actually have to now behave with full ESG, because if you go to a public market at the moment, if you raise public bonds, one of the first things that institutions will be looking at is, where's your ESG report? So, I mean, that's a broader issue about, where are you with respect to environment, where are you with respect to society, how you treat your customers, how you treat your people, then governance and all of that, right? So, I mean, it's a very broad church. Impact investment is really where I think the people I speak to are very much involved in, and that's broader than just climate change and decarbonisation. It includes things like new vaccines in health or new medtech devices. It includes education, developing world. It includes citizen financing. It includes a whole number of different things. It could mean investment in electric vehicle charging, hydrogen cars, anything that you believe is going to make a radical change to the world. And clearly decarbonization is at the very core. But if you narrow in the impact in terms of climate change investment, I think Eddie and I think over our years working in this space have seen people start with private equity. The majority of where we started was with private equity, which was a limited amount of capital to get things moving in your company. But then progressively, and Eddie has been at this longer than I, but certainly what we have seen is we now actually have more green capital out there than projects. That is the reality. I'm in processes at the moment whereby there could be 25 to 30 different institutions basically looking to get into a platform, because they have been able to get into a platform because they've been auctioned out of it in a bidding process. And as a result, they basically want to invest in development platforms that are actually going to make an impact. But more importantly, by the way, at the end of the day, that impact investment needs to have a rate of return, right? So it's a shareholder value play with an impact in terms of society. But I can tell you there are trillions, in my view, of capital out there, all chasing similar projects. Now, and I know this is an intro already, but it wasn't always like that. But it is like that now. And if you have a track record, it is clearly much easier to raise that money. And in fact, actually, you're finding institutions and insurance companies and very large family offices doing things that they would never envisage doing 5 to 10 years ago, and certainly 20 years ago. they weren't available to play at the very fledgling era of decarbonisation. Your wind farms, Eddie, for example, at the very, very start. It was difficult to get project finance and raising money out of friends and family to get things going as I did. It's moved on completely to a different space.
Yeah, you're right about that. There's a wall of $70 trillion out there looking for investment. But unfortunately, our industry right now is on its knees. The Vestas recently announced that their profitability for this year will be minus 6%. And they're the most profitable wind turbine company. So investors, need a return. Pension funds have got to look after their members for, 20 years in the future. You can't invest in a losing industry. And we've gone at a fraction of the money that should be going into our industry, going into it right now. I mean, I think Bloomberg issued a statement there saying that we built 63 megawatts per week last year. If we want to decarbonise by 2050, we have to build 613 megawatts per week. McKinsey, there very recently said we need to be spending 9.3 trillion a year on renewables, as distinct from a current 3 trillion. Now, I didn't know that there was 3 trillion being spent, but we're not spending anything like the amount we need to decarbonise. And the reason is because our industry lacks profitability. Now, I'm not aware of Amarenco and John's ventures and how profitable they are, but it's only by taking very large risks at the moment that you make profit. Like we did in Mainstream, we developed Nartnacuia in Scotland and then we sold it for 665 million. But that was an extraordinarily high risk process. From the basic bread and butter, the oil and gas industry makes 22% profit before the latest surges, probably in the mid-30s now. And we are making, at this level, no profits. And for instance, in Chile, we had a company, Senvion, who had a big contract for nearly 1,000 megawatts of wind going out of business. And that cost us an absolute fortune. And there used to be 15 wind turbine companies in Europe in the noughties. Now there are 4. And I think that Enercon don't have a chance of survival. So you're down to 3, and Siemens has changed its chief executive 3 times in the last 3 years, can't make profit. And that's what we're trying to build, a platform to actually take on the oil and gas industry, and we can't do it. It's not happening at the scale or anything like the scale that it needs to for the future. And so we have to intervene with the policy community and let them understand this, that if you want this level of investment, you have to actually root some of the profits that are inherently there. For instance, when we bid in Chile first, let's say in 2014, $11 was the price of a unit of electricity. Due to our activities and others, it's now 3. So the electricity consumer in Chile is absolutely gaining massively. When you look at what the Crown Estate in England did and the state of New York leasing offshore properties, they've made billions just from having that land. No risk, just to have the land. But the basic industry that's going to deliver on all this decarbonisation just is on its knees at the moment.
Is there an issue caused by traditional electricity market design where electricity markets have operated on the basis of marginal cost determining a clearing price? And clearly now, I guess that would have promoted efficiency amongst thermal plants. Whereas now where we have zero marginal cost renewable energy playing a very significant role in the markets, ultimately it's going to be driving down the price below what the real value of the utility is.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, I mean we have a dramatic effect on the price of electricity for now. But if we want to actually go to a situation where we're something like 100% renewable, wind and solar basically, bit of nuclear, a bit of hydro, some biomass, but very little. We have to think things out completely differently. We're going to build in Europe, if we want to decarbonise, something like 900,000 megawatts offshore. We need to build the same, about 800,000 to 900,000 megawatts of solar as well. And then you have completely decarbonised. But if you're going to take all this energy in the sea, and particularly in Ireland, where you have this fantastic wind resource off the west coast and indeed off the south coast as well. But it gets really high up north of Galway. 65% capacity factor is available there. This is there. It's there for us to do, but we don't have any grid. So and that'll be 6 times, according to Eamon Ryan, that'll be 6 times the demand in Ireland, and so therefore you have to find a way to get this into Frankfurt and Budapest, Warsaw. The whole of Europe. It has to, if we want to decarbonise, and we do need to decarbonise. So,
and this I guess is almost like it's our oil moment, but it's considerable infrastructure is needed to just make it a possibility. And John, in terms of what you're seeing with the markets in which you're operating, so it's one case when renewable energy is brought on board to the extent that it is going to supplement fossil fuel generation, and it can reasonably well coexist. But when it starts exceeding thresholds at which it has a real material bearing on the operation of the power system. So, you're displacing conventional plant that's giving you inertia, it's giving you high availability, etc. Is that a ceiling that's starting to be reached in markets, and is that causing a limitation? So we effectively need the power systems now to adapt to be able to absorb the renewable energy that is available to them.
I'm a firm believer that if you want to see what the future is like, let's look at some modern history. And I remember a time when Eddie was looking to try and put more wind farms on the grid, and there was a moratorium on the grid, and we had no grid investment. I know you smile now, Eddie, but it was one of those damning decisions that basically was made that interrupted the rollout of onshore wind in Ireland for many, many years. And I actually was one of the reasons, if you remember, why you decided Scotland next and then the United States. And in many ways, by the way, I made a speech the other day at the Cove and Harbour Chamber of Commerce, not far from my own home, where I basically stated that, we would not be over-investing in Ireland, a bit like what Eddie would have said historically, purely on the basis that the planning system here is absolutely broken. If we have any aspirations, in essence, to move to that point whereby we do, as Eddie has highlighted, and as we're participating to a lesser extent in, to really harness the wind resource that we have right across our coast. We have to speed up foreshore licensing. I was chairman of a port. It was a nightmare trying to get foreshore licensing to do the things to import and export goods. So we really need to have a fast-track emergency power approach to this. Thankfully, across Europe, since the war started, you've seen a number of countries actually bring in that. For example, in Portugal, we don't need to do an environmental impact statement anymore for a solar farm. Just go on and build it, as far as they're concerned. So there's a lot of lessons. And when in this country, it is an absolute nightmare to get through the planning system. And I really worry about the intensity of grid and the expectation of grid in this country to be able to harness, to provide effectively the supply chain and the route map for those electrons, not just to stay in Ireland, but to be exported. And this is where maybe Supernode comes into to a larger extent. If you look what the Chinese did, Chinese have uplands up in the northwest corner of China. They put in 750 kilovolt DC lines all the way down to the population centres. It's that type of envisioning you actually have to have. So there's a fantastic opportunity, but I despair at times when I hear politicians talking about hydrogen will solve everything. We have offshore, as if it's going to happen of itself. It can only happen if it's fully enabled by a country and fully enabled by the politics within. And frankly, that's where we've come unstuck. And by the way, as investors, and we are responsible to our shareholders, you don't make decisions to invest in a country because it's the country of your passport. You actually invest in a country because it's a country that actually gives you the best enablement to achieve the impact that you want to actually carry out. And frankly, we're in 15 countries now. And I would absolutely say from a planning process alone, this is number 15 of 50. And in terms of use of capital, which again is available, it is much better spent in Oman. It's much better spent in Egypt or in Portugal or Spain currently, where we're, we our 15% that spot in the market on solar made more money than the 85% that was contracted in the last 12 months. But that's just opportunity because of the crisis that we're in. But frankly, you can have all of the best plans on a shelf, but if you don't have an implementation program that's going to work, we're never going to get there. And this is where I despair.
And our history so far in terms of renewable development isn't in solar. It's been in wind. Mm-hmm. But as we look forward, one of the big challenges that are faced, of course, is that now we need to supplement the characteristics that we're losing from conventional plants. They sit there, they can be started, they can be run, they can feed it enough fuel, it'll run for as long as you want it. And we need, in order to decarbonize, we need to try to bring on new technologies that will actually supplement those characteristics. So, for example, the need for storage on the system. And if we look at the investment case, the sizing of storage on the system now is all towards high-speed system services. Really, that's where the value is. So, if we look at power and we look at time for energy, so then basically you want lots of megawatts for a short period of time. At present, you've made most of your money in the first 20 minutes. So that is a world away from being able to deal with a 2-week frost in the country where you're left without wind for that period.
You know what Hibernia means? Winter.
Winter, yeah.
Yeah, the Romans never came here because it says that's Hibernia. That's winter all the time.
Yeah.
You get your 14% capacity factor here. No,
you're very lucky. You're very lucky.
You're very lucky.
It's 11.5%.
But can I go back to you began off at an interesting point there about how we can use the conventional fossil fuel generators now as backup, and how are you going to do all this when they don't exist? Mm-hmm. And you've done away with them. And the characteristics of wind and solar are both the same in one regard. Wind is variable and solar is genuinely intermittent. You don't get any at night. So if you can imagine, there's 200 storms arrive off Ireland every year. Okay, they travel at 56 kilometres an hour, basically. And they travel over Ireland, usually. Now, they can come from any direction, but mainly from the southwest. And they travel up, and it peaks in Ireland. And then it peaks in England, much higher peak with much more installed capacity than Holland, Belgium, Germany, Denmark, and so on and so forth. When you put in a big grid there to that, and you capture, let's say, a big ramp up in Ireland, you have a lot of generation off the west coast, ramps up, then because if you are heavily interconnected, your profile looks kind of flat. This is not a trivial fact. This gets to the heart of how much investment in storage do you have to put in. And then when you look at wind and solar, if you put your wind or solar down the south and your wind in the north, which makes an awful lot of sense. The International Energy Agency came out with a graph there recently which showed almost complete complementarity. I mean, if I'd drawn it myself, I couldn't have, I wouldn't have been so bold as to assume that such balance was achievable. So again, that requires your big grid to be able to bridge those two. Very big, heavy connector between the Mediterranean basin, where you get your 30% capacity factor with solar, and with the great wind resource in the north. And we've hit this. We've hit the stops now. In Germany, in the last 2 auctions, there was no wind awarded because they're already at curtailment of 9% due to the variability of wind and solar, because they're both in Germany. And in Ireland, we're at, and I know on one of our farms down in Kerry, we were at 12%, just curtailed off. And when you get to, given the lack of a continental-wide grid, we're now in a bind where you can't do very much more on land or anywhere else, because how do you cope with this variability without building an enormous amount of storage? So the grid is the first big answer that you need. Well, first to capture the resource and to bring it to the people, and secondly to balance, to do this balancing effect. In other words, how do you completely get away from fossils?
And so that's a very, really highlights, it's a very fundamental problem driving a fundamental direction shift that we need to take in terms of the investment in grids. Whereas I suppose to date, everything is looking at key local issues. And if we, I suppose in terms of the timeline for delivering a super grid. We're really focusing past 2030 in terms of delivery.
Oh yeah, you have to be. Yeah, I mean, in this utility game, this big, highly capital intensive business, if you haven't planned for it for 10 years ahead, you're probably not going to make it. It's just everything John mentioned, and the difficulties of planning here. And planning in a lot of places is tough, but it's really bad here. But that's just planning. Then you have to change the policy in many countries. You have to interact with the policy community, the politicians, civil servants, their advisors, etc., and convince them. So it's really, we're engaging this once-off transition to sustainability, and the world has never been here before. It's never had to do this, or never appreciated that it did. So we're in a really difficult, if you like, policy environment. And all the stuff that John said is all correct. And I know that whenever, I've met the presidents, the prime ministers, the ministers of energy, and all these countries go into, and the question on their lips is, how do you do this? Because we've seen it done in various other places, and the world doesn't know how to do this. So there's that's part of the problem.
Yeah. And so we need then to focus on net zero is the final goal, and where does 2030 feature along that, rather than us setting an objective for 2030, which is an inappropriate stepping stone towards our net zero.
Yeah. So I take a view that solar in Ireland has a role to play maybe for the next 4 to 5 years until offshore comes on stream. I'm convinced by that. We have to make progression. Eddie's correct. We're going to run out of distributed generation locations, fairly quickly. We already are actually in many instances. But both Eddie and I have had the honor of running semi-state companies in this country, and my first job was a shift control engineer. When Eddie was doing all the purchasing in ESB, I was controlling the burn, as we call it, in the National Control Centre. And the one thing I learned at 21 or 22 years of age is that you actually need to have quite a variety of things to make the cake. And frankly, I get a sense that there are people, again, going back to the body politic, that actually take a view that the solutions are there and the solutions are instant when they're not, actually, because you actually have to get the right mix. And frankly, we haven't had the right signals, for example, on a number of things. As a renewable investor in Ireland or in any other location, until such time as we have all of those battery technologies and other sources of capability to reduce the level of curtailment for renewables, we still need to actually have gas generation. So therefore, the concept of not having LNG, by the way, is absolute. It's blind man's bluff, right? In my view, because I just give an example. Corrib is going by 2029. We will have no indigenous gas anymore in the country. We got 2 interconnectors to a country that's not part of Europe anymore. We have no storage in this country. We have 2 weeks pipe storage, by the way, for only domestic customers. And frankly, if we had a gas crisis between now and 2030, renewables would not be the answer. So that there are much higher order issues going on here that will have to be addressed. Gas is a transition fuel until such time as we got the right mix of offshore, onshore, solar, and all of the technologies, such that we can actually have an appropriate control system. Now, those of us who were engineers did control systems in our undergraduate years, and it's really important to make sure that you actually don't get out of control. And it's really important that we actually have as many tools available to us as possible until our main diet is going to come from offshore wind. There's no doubt about that. It is going to dominate the horizon in this country. But there is a transition, and you can't skip steps, because if you skip steps and make short-sighted decisions with respect to energy security, it will ruin the economy, and then we will have bigger issues to deal with. So in my view, there is a kind of rhetoric that is quite dangerous. That frankly, it's all about renewables, like stupid. It's actually not all about renewables when it comes to the holistic nature of energy transition. Like we're building an energy storage battery. It's one of the largest in Europe. We're building one in the southwest of France. It's 100 megawatts, building it with NIDEC. And, in a country, by the way, that does not have the same curtailment statistics that Eddie mentioned, right? It doesn't have that level of penetration of renewables that we do, right? Very small in comparison. And it has nuclear. It's got big inertia, machines basically on its grid. But the government is supporting these particular processes. Going back to what Eddie said earlier, the policy is actually saying we're going to have to start this market now in expectation of having higher penetration of renewables in the future. It's exactly the same decision in France that says, if you're a farmer and you want a free barn, talk to a solar company because we'll give you enough money in the tariff to allow the roof of that barn, a fabulous barn, 100 metres by 30 metres. You would not see any barn like this in Ireland with 100 kilowatts on top. And the 100 kilowatts pays for the barn, for the farmer. And we're an agricultural nation and we actually don't have that simple policy. I just think that it does come back to the enablement in the market. And frankly, whilst Eddie and I are risk takers in what we do, I'm not too sure that we have too many of them in Ireland that understand where we're ultimately going to go and the risks that we're taking by making some short-sighted decisions or some short-sighted policy statements and where we have to get to in terms of a step-by-step, like salami slicing your way to a full net zero. So that transition is going to have to be carefully managed, but I'm not too sure that we have too many people with what I would call a holistic view of the energy market making decisions on our behalf as citizens.
And when we look at pricing signals to stimulate investment, when we look at near-term objectives in the power system, like the need for a ramping margin service or a fast frequency response or or inertia with synchronous condensers, it's pretty easy for between the system operators and the regulators to set out in their mind's eye as to what the pricing signal is to stimulate that. But then when you're looking beyond that and you're looking at something that really requires deep research to uncover the actual viability and possibility, but you know that the need is there and the assumption is if there's need, there's value. What's needed then in terms of as the pricing signal to stimulate investment? Is it EU policy? Because I assume EU policy will always be stronger than the national policy in this regard.
Well, particularly in Ireland, the EU has made a dramatic difference to Ireland in every conceivable way. We were a barely inhabited island off the mainland up to the time we joined the EU, and we were losing population at a phenomenal rate. And now the population is almost double what it was, in 1960. We're getting on very well, but the kind of thinking that you have now, and I agree with John when he says, there's very little thought being put into what's it going to be like to operate, and you alluded to it yourself there, without this balancing, the ability to turn on up and down, put your gas burner up and down as needed. It's like a jet engine, up and down. Taking off, it's at full thrust, and then in cruising, it's way down. And without that, how are we going to actually do this? And there's a number of solutions, and you have to bear these in mind. The Bible said, without a vision, the people perish. And that's where I come in, and I base a lot of my stuff on thinking on this, that you have to, whatever happens, and John's right about gas in the short term, there's no doubt about that, but there's enough guys out there solving that particular problem. So I don't see myself as having any role to play at all in that. I see, how are we going to do this? And you need a big grid, you need a lot of storage, and you need demand side management. This is very important. Price signals, instantaneous price signals that when the price exceeds, X, then you switch off, so many hundreds of thousands of freezers. People who've already pre-agreed with you that you can do that. And then if you continue to have a shortage, and you alluded to, a shortage of wind power in any particular area, well, then you just have to keep on going with that. And you can quench a lot of load without actually reducing the service levels for customers. But again, back to this issue, this short-term issue of lack of profitability in our, and by the way, I agree with what John's doing is great in terms of the solar. Every roof in Europe, by legislation, should be made out of solar panels. I can't see why they don't do this. Just no matter where you're building, whether it's a factory or it's a house, just and I've seen this in Germany. It's not something that's pie in the sky. There are at least 3 companies supplying these tiles, and they seal your house and they keep the rain out, but they also make electricity. So you have a roof that's a little power station, and you could have that all over. And that would make, it's not going to cure your big industrial load, and it's not going to cure, the commercial load, but it is going to deal largely with household load.
I guess the challenge is that you don't, system operators are tasked with, you alluded to it earlier, John, they're tasked with not making sure that the power system doesn't just work well all the time. It has to work perfectly all the time. That's and that the effects of the fallout of that not being the case is key. And I suppose there's a strong impetus not to go down the route of, let's say, what's been seen in South Australia, where you just see a huge ramping up of embedded solar resources on the system that are uncontrolled. But the fact is that now we're at the point where controllers, the inverters are controllable, so they can be actually brought in, and it's about harmonizing them. And one thing that I suppose shocked me of late was that when visiting ESB Network's project in Dingle, where they were showing demand response in action, every house in Ireland is supposed to have an import capacity of 12 kVA. But we visited a house, and the import capacity of 12 kVA, actually, there was 6 houses all being served off a single 15 kVA transformer. And I was quite surprised by this, only to be told that's representative of about 40% of the residential housing stock in Ireland. Now, where this comes from, I guess, is this was it was optimal system design. So you don't design for the peaks. You assume that there's diversity in terms of how people use power and behavior, yeah. But the challenge now is as you electrify transport and heat, they are taking away the diversity. So now you need to artificially try to bring that back in. And just on the point of demand response, and I guess that is very much what we focus on at Viotus, there's 2 strands of demand response, one being implicit and the other being explicit. So implicit is you're given a price signal and people respond to it. But, coming back to the reliability of operation of the power system, the grid operator can't have dead certainty in terms of what that response is, particularly in short time. So but it's also important to bring demand response into the explicit role, which is what we work on, which is actually bringing considerable megawatts to the disposal of the system operator. It's declared like a power station, and they can dispatch you like a power station. And I suppose the key difference there for the value for the customer as well is that when you look at implicit, so price responsive, you're only benefiting when you are taking action. Whereas with explicit, you're providing benefit just by being there. So by being available. So like a power plant on standby, you're providing benefit. And like I often say, like a burglar alarm in a house doesn't just provide you value when you're robbed. It's good to have all the time. And I suppose that is the one of the range of services. And it kind of brings me into the point around the fact that, so we look at demand response, then the storage industry looks at storage, and there's areas where they complement each other. Then you look at your other technologies like your synchronous condensers as well on the system, etc. Now, when we look out towards the delivery of the solar and wind onto the system going forward, its use is going to be predicated on a lot of other technologies and services playing their role to actually allow the grid operators to utilize the resources that you're bringing to bear, and be it also through changes in technology and how the grid itself functions. So I suppose previously when we would have invested in wind up to a certain point of penetration on the system, you got your return. There was a reasonable likelihood it was unlikely to be curtailed. But for investors now going forward, particularly when you look at feed-in tariffs saying that you're going to still be exposed to negative pricing and that's going to continue, how do investors view this in terms of the where should the risk sit? If you deliver your solar project, but another facet of the grid in which you're reliant to have it used isn't delivered, is that your responsibility and should you be held to account?
I can just give you the most recent history of that, which is last Friday's auction, which was probably one of the most interesting auctions.
In which country, John?
Here.
In Ireland.
In Ireland, So there are a number of learning points coming out of that. Number one, by the way, the capex increases and the supply chain was absolutely within the numbers that came out. So the average price went up by around 25 euros a megawatt hour right across the board. for both wind and for solar. A lot of wind guys didn't go into it because they prefer to go merchant because they're part of utilities and they're going to internalize effectively the merchant. Very late in the day, a study was done about the constraint level on the grid going out into the 2030s. And you're absolutely correct about the resilience piece, Ryan. There was doubts about the Celtic interconnector, for example, and this goes back to supernodes, etc. Having outlets, by the way, and inlets, by the way, is really important because you then have resilience of grid as a result of that. And constraint levels would go up enormously if the Celtic interconnector or other interconnectors don't actually come on in the medium term in 27, 28, 29. And we were looking at around 12% constraint levels. So there are many ways to skin this cat, by the way, right? I really think that, demand side management is absolutely there and there needs to be a greater emphasis on it. It needs to be supported again by policy. And I think with respect to grid, we have had a history of investing a grid behind the developers, and we've never had a history of investing a grid ahead of developers. And frankly, we're going to have to do that. Not alone for ourselves, but more importantly, for export. Because it is that, barrel of oil that we'll be able to sell into the future into our colleagues in the European Union. And it'll get us away, by the way, from the Boris Johnson factor, where we might actually find that, we have resilience against actually gas being reduced in the two interconnector pipelines in 2040, 2041 or 2042. So this is where we have to go. You have to think about what could happen in 2050.
You mentioned the whole thing about integration, and something I should mention. We have about 300 million vehicles in Europe, and let's say we have an average of 100 kilowatt hours in the batteries of those vehicles by 2040. I think we probably get there. There's this massive acceleration in the electric car. And there really is no competition for this. This is wonderful. 14 different parts as compared with 1,100 in a fossil fuel car. But I started doing some sums recently about what if that, of all those batteries, which the public utility didn't have to invest in, were made available to the public to support, variability of wind and solar. And I start doing some graphs on that. And actually, you save a vast amount of money and make cheaper electricity as a result of, because I've made my investment in my car and I'm not thinking about the grid. And in fact, the batteries are needed to get me from A to B. But if I was connected through, again, a smart meter, but that exists already with the grid, and you could nominate, I need enough to go home this evening, and I have to visit my mother as well. So, I want to get left with 40%, but I've got 80% in now. So you can have access to 40% of my power. That's quite possible to do. And you save, at the upper end of this, and I won't go into all the assumptions, but you could save 1.9 trillion in investment in batteries. But even if you had very minimal take-up of this, you'd be talking about 100 billion. That's the very minimum you could get from this. So we're going to see, it's an interconnected whole, as you alluded to. There's no one magic bullet. There's no one particular philosophy that's going to work here. You just... Technology is going to be in so many different areas, and somebody has to kind of start putting those together at the policy level. Well, how do we give price signals to incentivize this and and stop doing that and all that stuff? So I just thought it was very interesting about batteries.
Really, and even the EV manufacturers, they set aside a value to contribute towards the recycling of the batteries. But the reality is that if your electric car drops down to 80% of its original range, you may change the battery. But that power to weight or the distance to weight is irrelevant in a 40-foot container. So then you get the secondary life of those EV batteries as well that can go down. So I suppose continuing to make use of that technology and the role that can potentially play.
It's interesting because I'm a director of a company which it does recycling, refurbishment of data centers and all of that. And in that there are power supplies and there are batteries. And these batteries basically would be in data centers. They've probably never been used in anger because they're there actually to act as a backup over 2 years for a data center, let's say. So these are absolutely non-degraded, but yet they go out effectively with the change of data center technology, as you know, every 2 years or 3 years effectively they change out. So we scoured the world and we couldn't find somebody who was actually taking these batteries and putting them into a new array or in a 40-foot container and actually relabeling these, essentially a reused but not used in essence, battery. I think we're going to see quite a significant amount of that happening as we're already seeing EV batteries coming to the end of their life or acceptable life for a consumer. And as we see data center batteries, coming to the end of life, or even UPS batteries coming to the end of life, there's a real opportunity to create new products and services coming out of those particular technologies. And at the moment, the worry is, where are they going? Are they ending up in landfill?
But I hope not.
I would hope not.
There's an awful lot of copper in those batteries.
And there's a shortage of lithium as well.
Yeah.
But that raises another question as to, so those batteries were sitting in data centers doing nothing for the majority of their life.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a huge opportunity there in terms of the actual embedded resources that exist in data centers to help support the system as it stands. Eaton, who was supplying a lot of batteries to the data center industry, they prepared a paper, I think it was with Bloomberg, where they were highlighting that their batteries can certainly serve the two purposes at once. Mm-hmm. And I think that there is a considerable latent value in terms of what data centers can provide to the system.
Yes.
Beyond, particularly, there's a lot of data centers that are supporting the renewable industry through corporate PPAs. And that's the procurement of renewable energy. But there's a key role that they can play in also enabling it, because in terms of being able to use their existing infrastructure to provide the types of reserve services that are needed to raise the ceiling on the amount of renewables that can be used, rather than just procuring it, there's a real opportunity for them to enable it. I suppose then there is accumulating pressure on that industry. So perhaps this would be
you're right,
an avenue to
change the narrative. It might change the narrative for them. Yeah, absolutely.
I suppose just rounding back on the point that grid always seems to come behind the integration. So Eddie, when you look forward at, you're quite unique in terms of your investment in an area that's, so it's not uncertain. The need is absolutely certain, but just the route to implementation has a long path ahead of it. What are the major barriers and obstacles that you need to see changed in order to make that supernode a reality for our lives?
Well, just to explain to your viewers and listeners, what supernode is. It's a new cable system that's going to allow the supergrid to be built and to both capture and distribute and transmit the 900,000 megawatts that's going to have to be built offshore in Europe, because that's where the real resource is, and also to link up again, for what we said previously, with the great southern resource around the Mediterranean. So that's what supernode is doing, and we're doing it using superconductivity, which is at certain materials when you're reduced to below critical temperature, they stop conduct. There's no resistance whatsoever, and we've had a look at that. And you can't actually decarbonize without supergrid, and actually you can't decarbonize and you can't build a supergrid without superconductivity, because there isn't enough copper. If you were trying to build this in conventional high voltage DC, there isn't enough copper, and I'm not so sure that even with opening copper mines you would have enough. And we are the actual replacement for that. 1 ton of yttrium, which we use it's a rare earth. 1 ton of yttrium is the equivalent of 30,000 tons of copper. Now, but that's so thin that it has to be supported. So it comes down to 1 to 300. If you take the other materials that are present in the tape, in the superconducting tape, it's still 1/300 the weight of what you have in copper. So we're onto a winner here. In turn, to answer your question directly, the two big challenges are: one is the technology. Can we get the heat transfer low enough from the environment into where this superconducting cable is? And that's what we're working on now. But the other one is to get the policy environment writ large in Europe so that they're not going around talking about the great, huge imposition on the body intellectual of carbon capture and storage. This nonsense has been going on for 25 years now, and it's never going to amount to anything. And then the latest, of course, the hydrogen economy. And nobody has pointed out that how do you burn metal? Well, you take a feed of oxygen, a feed of hydrogen, bring them together and burn it. Now, you want to get the hydrogen back out of the water that's created by this. You have to put at least the same energy back in. That means that you're always going to have, you'll only get out 70%. If you put in 100 megawatt hours, you're going to get out 70 megawatt hours. And that's before you start burning it. And once you start burning it, the laws of conventional thermodynamics come along. And so you're into, Carnot efficiencies and all that stuff that we learned in university. So hydrogen is not your solution here. But the oil and gas industry sold Europe, when we were all locked down 2 years ago, they descended on Europe. And now they're going to spend 550 billion on the hydrogen economy in Europe. Now, you need the 70 million tons of hydrogen that need to be generated from water every year to replace what's exactly there as used as a feedstock. But to talk about hydrogen cars as compared with electric cars just doesn't add up. It's just nothing competes with electricity for most applications.
And I'd imagine that hydrogen will play some role, but I definitely would agree with that. There's been quite a bit of fanfare almost promoting it as somewhat of a silver bullet solution. And a concern that I'd always have with anything that's promoted as a silver bullet solution is that it takes attention away from a lot of the other very viable solutions. I'm just really interested to know, what's the size of the conductor used for?
Well, we have a 1/10. 1/10 is about that thick. We built that already, and we demonstrate. We're buying lots of machinery now to test out our various insulation methods, and a vacuum. Drawing vacuums is very important here because a vacuum is the most perfect way of insulating. But then vacuums they're hard things to deal with because various molecules like air, particularly hydrogen, but also oxygen, diffuse in through the walls. And so the vacuum gets filled up eventually if you put in a real hard vacuum. So that's not an option open to you if you want this thing to last for 30 years or 40 years. But it's great fun. I mean, it's going to take us 60 million to get the prototype up and running at technology readiness level 6 by 2025. And by 2029, then we should have a saleable product that will just transform the grid. And we need to convince Europe that this is necessary. One of their own reports in one of their research findings said it was, but there's a big difference between that and then becoming a directive, which is what we need.
I suppose the challenge that you're going to face when you're talking about something like microns of a conductor is that people think in nuts and bolts. They like what they can see, they like what they can imagine the mechanics of. So people like to really get to a point of this being in policy. There's a whole mental shift even for people to be able to think at the level of what this can do, something that they don't have a frame of reference almost for it in terms of your typical engineer. I'm an electronic engineer and I'm really having to come up to speed to try to even visualize what this is doing.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of, but we've been on this pathway now for a long, long time, since 1997 when we set up electricity. That you have to explain to people. You have to find imaginative ways of communicating with them, and some of them are quite reluctant. And for instance, the company that John and I used to work with, the ESB, they wrote a statement in 1988, and it hasn't changed since. We will not innovate. We will not innovate. Right? A company that doesn't innovate. What? Where would you be if you didn't innovate? Where would you be if you didn't innovate? You wouldn't exist.
And that was set out in paper.
That was set out in paper. And I well recall, I had a great regard for Paddy Moriarty, who was the chief executive at the time. But Airgrid are a bit like that now, unfortunately. I don't mind saying that. I don't mind being promulgated there because we've been onto them for a long time. We could cure an enormous number of problems in the distribution and transmission system in Dublin. It's broken. It's quite badly broken, actually, with using superconductivity like they did in Essenar and Seoul. Airgrid don't want to know about it.
Or do you want this? The semi-states also, they're hugely entrenched in terms of almost legacy hardware, legacy infrastructure. that back to the point that you made about hydrogen. Hydrogen, you were saying about the vested interest there, basically saying the hydrogen economy, we continue to make use of our existing gas infrastructure, etc. So maybe that's a reason why we don't want the semi-states to.
This is the problem. You can put in 15 to 20% of your electricity, your hydrogen into a pipe for gas, but that's about it.
Yeah, but maybe the point is that maybe that's why you don't want the semi-states to be tasked with the innovation, because they'll continue to try to sell you more of the...
Well, it makes room for three of us here.
More of the same.
Great.
Look, I mean, I know certainly innovation would have been difficult. We set up a fund, or innovation fund in Borgosh when I was there, but again, it wasn't sort of large scale. For a company that was earning the profits, it was earning probably a 10 million innovation fund, basically to support various entrepreneurs and venture capitalists to go out and come up with new energy solutions. But the reality is that semi-state companies are not set up to really be at the vanguard of what say Eddie's doing in terms of Supernode, or what others are doing in terms of new devices. It's a different type of company is going to do that, and it should always be like that in my view, because it's extremely difficult in a company that is tasked with fairly serious things to go off and divert itself into basically what are skunk works in many ways for them. In saying that, they should be the first people to, in my view, assist Irish technologists to try and get pilots going, such that we do produce energy solutions that are not just for ourselves, by the way, but are there for global consumption.
Yeah.
And that's where I think we have not had a great track record.
Well, I suppose recently our experience with EirGrid has almost been to the contrary in that. So to take part in DS3 system services, if you're not a proven technology, you need to go through what's called a qualification trial process. So they'll bring in unproven technologies, you'll demonstrate its capability, and then you can commercially take part in the market. And so we would have brought in, let's say, our highest speed frequency response systems. Yeah. They monitor 8,000 times a second, and they'll...
Really?
Yeah, 8,000 times. So when we entered the market as a demand response provider in 2013, we were setting the market our 1 second monitoring, and now it's like 8,000. So each of our power...
It's primary reserve.
Yeah. Well, right down at fast frequency. So it's a case of, if a power station trips in some place in the island, at the opposite side, we'll be turning off loads well within 100 milliseconds. Okay. So that's what we target, and that's what we do. And these are tens of megawatts of loads. And the process for that was demonstrating it to EirGrid, demonstrated that it could work, and then you can commercially take part. And where that has really stood to us very well, actually, is then when we established in Australia, because with this DS3 System Services program, EirGrid is held in high regard internationally in terms of its integration of intermittent, low inertia renewable energy, using, or at least allowing for reasonably novel approaches to solving the problem. So I suppose having gone through that process with EirGrid, and EirGrid being held in high regard in Australia, and us having gone through that process with EirGrid and being commercial here, kind of got us by association. It was what we were doing was somewhat validated.
All you need now is to bring in the superconductor with that solution, by the way. And
I know, absolutely. Yeah. And when we just coming back, I suppose, there's a challenging mountain in terms of like the need to change, like inform minds in the education process for something like superconductors. But obviously, John, what you're delivering in terms of solar, we see it in front of us. There's like so many international examples. It's just evident that this is a good solution, and there's also money waiting at the door of deployment. But what are the key obstacles that? Is it your planning, your grid infrastructure? What are the key obstacles that need to be addressed in order to actually have the country reach its potential of solar integration or other renewables for that matter? I
mean, I think that the history of renewables in Ireland is a very interesting history. I think Eddie could write 9 to the 10 chapters, I think. But I remember ESB's attitude when Bellacorrick was built. You remember it well. And they'd say, this will never catch on. And then you did the second one. I was up there. I think it was actually the second one that came on, I think it was Barnesmore Gap, I think, or one
That's
of
right.
them.
That's right. That wasn't ours. But
That was I think it was Scotch Power, one of them. Yeah,
one of them. Yeah,
one of them. Yeah, and they still said this is not going to take off. And even in my time in ESBI, I kept on saying to the guys, we should really be thinking about, over and above, because we were investing in gas turbines internationally, to really think about wind. And then, there were a lot of obstacles along the way in terms of wind farms. I mean, just market obstacles, by the way, to begin with. Forget about the planning issues. But then, when I set up Amarenco, we were working in France, and thankfully they had a very good regime, and the planning system was much easier. But then when I started prospecting with farmers in County Cork and County Waterford back in 2014 and told people this is what I wanted to do, they all thought I was crazy. But crazy is good, by the way, in this game. And it's great because I got a picture of two Murphy's construction trucks and JCBs moving in on site this morning in Whitechurch in Kanturk, right, where we've started now finally to build, but it took 7 years. But nobody really looked at what the trends were with respect to the price of solar panels and where they were going to go. Nobody looked, and you remember this, in terms of onshore wind, how big they were going to get and how cheaper they were going to get over time. And in offshore, we're still not at the peak of where offshore wind is actually going to go in terms of, size of units, 20, 30 megawatts at a time, and one huge turbines. This is where the vision starts. It starts with where you think the technology solution is going to be, and you work your way back and you integrate it. But it's great, as both for Eddie and for myself, that we were going around the country, and my time in Borgas set up a renewable division, bought SWS and built up that company, went on to Brookfield. The beauty of my own hometown now, by the way, is that we now have 6 international renewable companies based out of Cork, which, 10 years ago they didn't exist. And it's a cluster. And it's a thing that you've been involved in and you're very proud of. But we're not just working in Ireland. The majority of our work actually is international, out of Cork. But the message I would say to you is, look, if you really want to bring all of these technologies on board, you can wax lyrical and rhetoric about it, and they exist. But you actually need to come up with a detailed plan that actually is going to enable them to come on and actually solve our problems. And frankly, that's where, when you look inside the engine, there are no component parts. And you really have to keep on lobbying and talking, knocking on doors to get things done. And by the way, at the end of the day, that is the resilience of an entrepreneur. Entrepreneurs don't accept no as an answer. And that's the one thing I've learned in my time in business. Keep knocking on the door.
I think that's a perfect note to finish on. That was really very interesting. Yeah. So John, Eddie, thanks so much. I really enjoyed the chat. I've learned an awful lot more about my own industry that I'm involved in as well. So thanks so much for sharing your experience and for taking me through your journeys.
No problem, Paddy.